Crenshaw explains that those impacts are about how structures make certain identities and the consequence of and the vehicle for vulnerability. So it's important as we look at these issues to employ a structural lens as we identify and analyze solutions to the exclusions of segments of the population and advance the vision of full participation, inclusion, and belonging. Belonging is not simply a matter of interpersonal goodwill. It is produced, constrained, and expanded by institutional design, policy frameworks, and power arrangements. And as we promised in these webinars, we do not just focus on the problems and their manifestations, but discuss solutions and answers to advancing immigrant integration. We've invited diverse experts from education, social psychology, and civil rights advocacy, a powerful convergence of scholarship, practice, and policy innovation to weigh in on this topic. Though they work at different sectors, their efforts align around the shared mission of advancing equity and democratic inclusion for immigrant and racially minoritized communities. So today's discussion brings together these leaders whose work collectively reframes one of the most urgent questions of our time. How do we build institutions that move societies from merely celebrating diversity or not at all to confronting inequity and institutionalizing full participation and belonging? And our first speaker is Professor Linda Trop, professor of social psychology, who's endowed university chair in peace psychology and faculty associate in public policy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She will deliver her special presentation. The floor is all yours, Dr. Trop.
Now just switching to slideshow presentation. All right. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for inviting me to be part of this session today. It's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to share the research with people who might be able to use it in a practical sense and thinking about policy implications as well. And just to acquaint everyone and make sure we're on the same page, I want to start off by providing a brief overview of research on intergroup contact. As a social psychologist, we're in this subfield, we're focused on contact between social groups as face-to-face interactions where we have some evidence that people from different backgrounds have actually had direct communication and engagement with each other. And this type of work has traditionally been used as a means of reducing intergroup prejudice. And I wanted to mention this feature of it being face-to-face actual interaction because in some other social science disciplines, the term contact is sometimes used to refer to proxy indicators like proportions of a community that might be from another background. But what we're focusing on is particularly cases where people actually interact with people from backgrounds beyond their own. And so over the last several decades, there have been hundreds of studies looking at what happens when members from different groups have contact with one another. We conducted a quantitative integration where we statistically pooled all of those studies to see overall what does that literature tell us. And that data set included more than 500 studies between 1940 and the year 2000 with data from more than 250,000 individual participants from 38 countries. And the too long didn't read version is that greater levels of intergroup contact or contact between groups from different backgrounds or identity groups is associated with lower levels of intergroup prejudice. And we've done many other analyses to show that the more rigorously studied these concepts are in terms of the design and the measures used, the more clearly you see this association that greater contact is associated with less prejudice. Now, this might sound different from what you may hear from other social science disciplines. Again, I'm a social psychologist, so there's a fair amount of evidence in fields like political science and sociology to suggest that greater neighborhood diversity, that kind of looser definition of contact where there are people cohabitating in the same neighborhoods, that greater racial diversity in one's neighborhood is associated with greater racial threat. However, I and some of my other colleagues, we've done additional research to show that there's actually two pathways that happen when there are diverse communities. That on the one hand, greater diversity can provoke greater feelings of racial threat, particularly among the dominant or historically advantaged group in that community. And at the same time, greater diversity affords greater opportunities for interracial contact. And the more that groups have contact with each other, they experience lower levels of intergroup or racial threat. So I wanted to take this type of research and apply it to the context of building welcoming communities between US born folks and recent arrivals due to immigration. So with some of my colleagues from a variety of fields, we conducted a multidisciplinary project to see the role that intergroup contact might play in promoting feelings of being welcome and also being willing to welcome others into one's home community. We conducted this study in the metro areas of Atlanta, Georgia, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And we chose these two cities as sites because they are both metro areas with very long-standing black-white dynamics and high levels of racial segregation, yet they have been diversifying increasingly in recent years due to rapid growth in immigration, and specifically immigration from Mexico and India. So for our study, we did random digit dial surveys of residents of the Atlanta and Philadelphia metro areas, and we recruited respondents from four different backgrounds, two US-born groups, white Americans and Black Americans, and then first-generation immigrants, specifically from India and Mexico. And we wanted to choose these groups to offer some comparisons where they're more complex than just a simple dichotomous dynamic between two groups, but also to think about the different status positions that these groups tend to occupy, where white Americans tend to be of higher status among the US born compared to Black Americans. And yet at the same time, US born folks tend to have higher status on the dimension of citizenship compared to first generation immigrants. In terms of socioeconomic status, both Indian immigrants and white Americans also tend to occupy higher positions in socioeconomics or using socioeconomic indicators, and also tend to have higher levels of education on average relative to Black Americans and Mexican immigrants. So for the purposes of our project, we were really interested in a couple of central research questions. How might the contact that these groups have with each other predict their willingness to welcome those other groups into their own community, and also the extent to which they feel welcomed by those other groups? And so respondents from each of those groups, these poor respondents, completed the exact same measures in relation to the three other groups in that metro area that I just identified. So to give you a sense of the specific questions we asked about contact frequency, or how often they interact with members of those other groups in their neighborhoods, in their jobs, and outside their neighborhoods. And we created a composite measure using those items. We also asked a separate question where we asked, well, if you have contact with this group, how friendly or unfriendly does it feel when you interact with them? And then to specifically address any negative experiences they might have had, we asked more specifically about discriminatory treatment, how often they feel they've been treated poorly or unfairly by members of each of those other groups. Now, just to walk you through what we see in terms of contact frequency or how often they interact with each other, here you can see that on average, US-born white and Black respondents are reporting more contact with each other relative to the levels of contact that they report with either of the first-generation immigrant groups. And then if we look from the perspective of immigrants, we also see that these first-generation immigrant communities tend to have more contact with the US-born than they tend to have with one another. But we also see some differences in terms of how welcome each of these communities feel. on average, if you look at US born whites in relation to each group and US born blacks in relation to each group, you see relatively high levels of feeling welcome on this 0 to 3 scale. Indian immigrants are also reporting relatively high levels of feeling welcome, but you see quite a divergence for our first generation Mexican immigrants who feel least welcomed by these other groups relative to the extent to which they feel welcomed amongst themselves. So Mexican immigrants tend to be more isolated, feeling less welcome in these communities relative to these others that we assessed surveys from. Now, the next thing that we wanted to do was to look at how members of each of these groups would be inclined to welcome each of the other groups and feel welcome by each of the other groups, taking into account all of these indicators, how often they interact with that group, contact frequency, how friendly or unfriendly that contact is, and also the extent to which they feel poorly or unfairly treated by members of that group. In these analyses, we also included an estimate of the proportion of that other group in the home community of the respondents. So in this case, we can see US born whites in the census tracts where they live, what proportion of that census tract consists of, in this case, Black Americans or Indian immigrants or Mexican immigrants. And we wanted to include this so that we could compare the relative effects of just having the presence of the other community in one's census tract as compared to the outcome of contact frequency, actually interacting with members of those groups. So for those of you more familiar with statistics, these are standardized regression coefficients where we're also controlling for age, gender, education level, employment status, home ownership, and political ideology as we examine these associations. So looking at US born whites in relation to US born blacks, we see pretty clearly that as compared to exposure or representation of the group in the census tract, having actual contact with Black Americans is associated with feeling more welcome by them and being more willing to welcome them into their own community. And that tendency is enhanced to the extent that they report friendly contacts. The friendlier the contact is and the more frequently it happens, the more likely white Americans are to want to welcome Black Americans into their community and to feel welcomed by Black Americans. We see very similar trends when we look at the experiences of US born whites in relation to our first generation immigrant samples, where again, it's really the contact they're having, not simply the presence of that other group in the local context that is contributing to these feelings of being welcome and to being willing to welcome others. We see, again, very similar trends when we look at the perspectives of US born Blacks in relation to white Americans, Indian immigrants, and Mexican immigrants. The more contact they have and the friendlier that contact is, the more inclined they are to welcome all of these communities and to feel welcomed by all of these communities. And yet again, we see really similar trends when we look from the perspective of Indian immigrants in relation to each group, and also from the perspective of Mexican immigrants in relation to each group. So together, these types of findings are offering evidence to suggest that it's not enough to just have people in the same space. We have to provide opportunities for them to actually engage with one another and really get to know one another in order to promote these feelings of welcoming and create more welcoming contexts of reception. I also wanted to mention an additional analysis we conducted with our first generation immigrant samples, where we show that the more they feel welcome by the US born, the more civically engaged they become, such as by contacting local officials or attending and participating in neighborhood meetings. And we can understand, if we feel welcome, of course we're going to want to participate more. So these contact effects not only have implications for how welcome people feel, but they may have downstream consequences for immigrants' engagement in those new communities in which they've settled. And so growing from findings like these and continuing from our work with policymakers and civil society organizations, we've tried to take insights from the intergroup contact literature and develop them in ways that would be practically useful for people trying to implement programs that bring host society and immigrant communities together and These were constructed in collaboration with Welcoming America and the Center for Inclusion and Belonging at the American Immigration Council, and I'd be happy to talk more about that later on. But for now, I want to save time for our other panelists.
Dr. Trop, thank you so much. What fascinating research you've been doing. It's absolutely fascinating, and it really does really emphasize and underscore the importance of that structured contact and, like you said, providing those opportunities, which we will talk about later in the roundtable. But now I'd like to thank you and turn it over to Professor Ana Cristina da Silva Eidings, who is a professor of the practice of education at the Department of Teaching and Learning in Vanderbilt University. Welcome, Chris. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I want to especially thank Guillermo for the invitation and all of you for your important leadership in such an important topic. So, yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to try to keep to my time, so I'm going to get right to it. Let me see if I can. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I am Ana Cristina da Silva Eddings. I'm at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. And today I have been invited to talk about education, multilingualism, and equitable learning. And before I go on to talk about it, I want to position myself on how I come to this work. I am myself an immigrant from Brazil. I'm also a multilingual learner. I have researched the educational circumstances of immigrant children in the US for over 25 years. I specialize in school and family community relations and the language and literacy teaching and learning for multicultural immigrant students. And the line through from this research is that working with immigrant communities and students and multilingual students, especially students of color, is very complex and require a comprehensive, critical, and integrated community approach. And I have been asked very thoughtful questions by the panelists in this group, and that I wanted to address one by one. The question that they ask first has to do with this notion of belonging and access in schools. How do we bring forth opportunities for immigrant multilingual students of color? And but before I address this question, I want to give you a sense of who are the immigrant communities in the U.S. There's a lot of misunderstanding about this. It's a vastly heterogeneous group. There are about 53 million immigrants currently living in the U.S. They make up roughly for 20% of the U.S. workforce. So very important population. 11 million of them are said to be undocumented, meaning don't have documents for the US. And in schools, we have about 12 million students who live in households headed by an immigrant. And as far as birthplace, of these 12 million, approximately 83% were born in the United States, meaning that they are US citizens with immigrant parents, while roughly about 17%, nearly 2 million, are foreign born. But it's important to notice that the intersection of race, ethnicity, nativity yields a uniquely minoritized identity that becomes very vulnerable and a target. They are racialized and unwanted bodies. And how are these immigrants received? I was listening with great interest in Dr. Trop's research, and I have used it in my own work and find it fascinating. But in reality, they are not welcomed and that we have anti-immigration laws, we have English-only policies in 32 US states, very restrictive immigration policies, militarized borders. We have the wall, migrant deaths, deportation, overt racism, raids in homes, workplaces, in places of worship, children's detention, family separations, fear and intimidation tactics, use of anti-immigrant rhetoric and language as a political weapon. And in fact, we have right now a reign of terror for immigrants. And the attack on immigrants in the US in the present represents a resurgence of old disproven idea about the inherited threat, physical, cultural, and economic, posed by immigrants. But importantly, what are the consequences of this narrative for immigrant children? Well, immigrant children and families are forced to decode the world through a narrative of illegitimacy, of being unauthorized, of not belonging, no matter the credentials, no matter the juridical authorization, and no matter the permanence of place or history, especially immigrant students of color. And these are stories that our immigrant children have woven into their sense of placemaking, their sense of belonging, not belonging, and their sense of citizenship, non-citizenship. And what is the impact of ICE on immigrant children in the US public schools? Well, we have noticed tremendously reduced attendance and enrollment, mental health and academic harm, family separations and school instability, reduced use of school services such as counseling, health screening, free lunch programs, undermined student safety, school policing partnerships have been disrupted, and of course, civil rights violations. These students are largely hiding in dark homes. So one of the things that we need to think about is how to bring them back into schools and how to keep them safe. In the second question, the panelists asked, what does culturally responsive teaching look like when explicitly includes immigrant histories, identities, and community knowledge? It's a very important question. But first, we have to understand, what does it mean for educators to respond to culture? So for educators, the concept of culture sometimes poses a pedagogical question as to how do we engage a diverse student body without falling into the trap of stereotypical and essentializing characterizations of our students. So essentializing definitions of cultures renders cultures as bounded, fixed, equally shared, consistent, and stable within homogeneous groups, recognizable by a laundry list of cultural traits that sometimes becomes something to be responded to. In my studies, I have interrogated these assumptions of a shared culture or a fixed and bonded culture, and have chosen instead to focus on culture as practice. That is, to focus on what is it that people do and what do they say about what they do. And in the next question, the panelists ask, what are some concrete practices that we can implement to better support multilingual learners and also who are also navigating racialization? Well, first, I want to cite the important research of Dr. Trupp and provide areas of contact, interaction between face-to-face interaction between immigrant and non-immigrant students and families, and to create context for action towards preserving educational opportunities, safety, well-being of immigrants, especially those of color. And also to create circulations of language and literacy, creating spaces that center multilingualism as a norm through translingual practices, create new forms of family and community engagements. I have done these practices in many of the schools and in different countries that I have been working and implementing this integrative model. But it's important that these areas of contact are spaces within schools that promote multilingualism and multiculturalism, that create connections and a space for integration, community, connection, and action. And to have these stories on the go, creating these circulations of languages and literacies, stories that circulate multilingually in classrooms, in schools, in communities. And these can be through portable backpacks or some literacy baskets or children's authored books. And also to encourage the telling of stories that are significant in the lives of immigrant families, learning about families' funds of knowledges and the ways that they practice literacies in the households, providing multiple opportunities for co-learning among teachers, students, and families with interest and curiosity. And also resisting monolingualism as the norm. Although much of the world is at least bilingual, the US monolingual norms remain as invariant standard that presupposes monolingualism to be the unmarked, unexamined category. In the next question, they ask about reducing disparities. What would I emphasize? And for me, right now in this moment, it's very important to create capacity for advocacy within school grounds, within school districts, within school communities, and to be able to create educational possibilities for these historically marginalized populations to counteract deficit perspective and to redefine context for learning in comprehensive ways, to inform, to connect, and again, advocate for these populations through connections with community organizations, expanding the capacity of schools by partnering with different organizations and circulating accurate information multilingually to immigrant families and community members. We have plenty of information, but many of these sources are often not trustworthy, and to really focus on family safety first at this moment. That is what we need most, is to keep these families protected and safe. And how do we measure belonging in ways that are meaningful and not just a checkbox? Well, again, it's a complex process and very comprehensive, but I believe that as educators, we have to take an approach towards ways to restore, elevate, renew, rediscover, acknowledge, validate the multiplicity of lives, lived experiences, culture, and knowledge of Indigenous people, people of color, and immigrants. And most of all, as educators and as professionals and as citizens of the United States, we have to have the courage to resist this decontextualized, dehistorialized, and generalized views of immigrants. I believe that being silent on such issues as race, immigration, and linguistic diversity adversely impacting children and families is simply not acceptable. Whether this agenda is conscious or disconscious of racism, the effect is the same: diverted attention and resources. I will quote Paulo Freire, the educator, to close this session. Washing one's hand of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral. Thank you. I can hear you.
Dina, I think you might be on
I'm
mute.
sorry. I'm sorry. Thank you so much. Yeah, that muting and unmuting, it creates always an issue. But Dr. De Silva, thank you so much for another fascinating conversation, another fascinating pieces of knowledge and wisdom that you shared with us. Can we look forward to having you at the round table after we hear from two of our speakers, two leaders in the field of immigrant integration who will share some reflections. And we will start with Adam Strom, who is the Executive Director of Reimagining Migration. Adam, the floor
Thank you
is
all.
yours.
Thank you all so much. You get to see my messy screen while I go to the slide deck. I used Canva. So I'm really excited to build on the first two speakers' presentations because I think you'll start to see where there's a convergence here. And I followed both of their work for a very long time. Linda knows I'm embarrassing like a little fanboy of Linda's work, but I've been following it for years, so I'm excited to be on a presentation with her. So just quickly, I'm the executive director of a nonprofit organization called Reimagining Migration. And what we're really trying to do is help schools become the sites of potential of belonging that they need to be so all of our young people could thrive. I would say our focus is clearly on trying to think about what in particular we could do to ensure that immigrant origin kids and their families feel a sense of belonging in their communities. But what I think you'll realize, and maybe that's why a lot of you are here, is so much of what we do to help immigrant families actually ends up making schools better places for everyone and actually helps transform the community in a broader way. But so let me ground us in this current moment at a school level. I appreciate what Anna Christina was doing, a little broader. John Rogers and his colleague Joseph Kahn just put together a really, I think, really powerful new new report called "The Fear Is Everywhere," and you can see the numbers here. It's not good. So, they did a survey of 700 principals around the country. Excuse me, 600 principals around the country. 70% of them are reporting students expressing fear about the safety of their family, for themselves and their family. And I'll say that a previous study that they did is when they started looking geographically. Some of the 30% is probably from administrators who may not really support immigrant families and immigrant rights. So my suggestion is that these numbers are probably higher. 64% report students from immigrant families missing school. 58% of them report immigrant families leaving their communities altogether. Just pause for a second. Think about what that means. 58% of principals have reported immigrants leaving their communities altogether. And I can guarantee this next number I'm showing is also a massive underestimate, which is that 36% of them are reporting bullying and harassment directed at immigrant students. So this isn't just a national policy. This isn't just what's going on in the news. This is getting trickled down into the classroom. And of course it does, right? So I believe when it comes to, building quality contact, quality interaction, schools actually have a really interesting and unique leverage point because of the roles that they play in our communities, right? I think they could be these little greenhouses of belonging if we do this right. Think about the leverage, right? The relationships between students and teachers, what contact could be looking like, between students and students, between teachers and immigrant families, between schools and community members. But these interactions don't just happen. I think that Dina said this really right. This is about the result of intentional policies and practices. And right now, policies and practices are not leaning into this leverage point that we have. I could go into a lot more depth here, but I'll say that each of these levers is actually really powerful and can be really transformative. So let's get into it later if this is of interest. When it comes to education and it comes to schools, I'd like to think about migration as both a lens to look at the world and the young people in our communities, but also a lever that could actually help prepare young people more broadly for the world in which they live. So think about, as a school, what is your design principles? I think we need to recognize as educators that migration is the through line of the human experience. Today I'm sitting here in San Francisco. San Francisco is not San Francisco without the history of migration to this community. I'm about 2 blocks from Chinatown, right? This is a Chinese immigrant who lived in Chinatown is the man who fought for birthright citizenship, which is now, a national standard, also being fought in the Supreme Court in a second. Two, if you're a teacher from a content perspective, migration can't just be a special topic. If it's the through line of the human experience, it really needs to be a lens for understanding the broader human experience from ancient humans through our science, through the DNA, through the literature we read, through the histories we teach. This is a lens for us to understand what does it actually mean to be human? Not just what does it mean to be a member of a community, what does it mean to belong in a particular place? Absolutely important, but I would argue it's more fundamental. And then three, and I hinted at this a second ago when I started, it's kind of have you all heard of the curb cut effect? The idea that when you built when the law for the ADA said that you have to have a curb cut for wheelchairs so they could get on and off the different pieces of the sidewalk. It turns out that those curb cuts, which were built for the ADA, help everybody. They help babies with strollers. They help the elderly. They help all sorts of people. And I would argue that when you design schools for a world of migration and demographic change, everybody's going to benefit because the kind of relationships you start to emphasize actually build a stronger community. We already know from deep academic research, the stronger a sense of belonging young people have, the more able they are to learn. It's like opening a world of possibilities. We were working with Veronica Boyce-Mencia at Harvard's Project Zero, and Veronica helped us A, develop our framework, and then B, identify kind of 5 core dispositions for a world of migration and change. So I offer this as a way to start to think about, like, what are the habits, the skills we want young people to work with? I'm going to give you a quick taste of what I'm talking about. Perspective taking, right? How important it is to be able to understand your own perspective, what shapes it and what others. We want people to be able to understand and inquire about migration with care and nuance. So therefore, when you're confronted with a stereotype like we all are right now, what does it mean to slow this down and question? How do we communicate and build relationships across difference? We don't want this just to be something that happens by accident, but actually a disposition that we actually are cultivating in schools. These are outcomes that we're looking for. How do we recognize the power and inequities in human experience? And migration is a powerful way to do that. My family shows up from Galveston, Texas in 1912. Nobody's trying to stop us from coming here. They got off the boat in Galveston, made their way up to Chicago. Think about how different that is in the experience of people arriving in Galveston, Texas today. That is an inequity that we don't talk about when people say you have to come the right way, whatever that supposedly means. And then ultimately to be able to take action when you start to see those inequities. So let me give you one really lovely story, I think, to give a sense of what this works like. This is a teacher, Sandy M., who teaches in Florida. I'm not going to identify what community for her, but Sandy is an EL teacher, and she was really frustrated. She noticed a lot of her kids were EL kids, that they had been kind of discouraged from joining the school clubs, and the EL kids wanted to belong. They wanted to be parts of these clubs, but the teachers who ran the clubs are like, "It's a pain in the neck. I don't want these kids." And so she was sort of bored. She's like, "Let me create a space for them." And she created something called an international cafe. But the kids are like, "We know we're being grouped here. We know that this is not really useful." So the kids started saying to her, "Aren't the families at the school from somewhere else? Don't they all have their own stories?" And so the kids researched every language that was spoken by all the different families at the school, all the countries where people came from in the school, and they started a greeting program. So this is the very first of them, where they would stand in front of the school once a month and greet people in all the different languages spoken at the school. It ended up becoming a big deal where year 2, Non-immigrant kids are like, hey, how do we become part of the greeters? And what I like about this story is that the kids who are told that they aren't welcome, they flip the script. They become the welcomers, right? And then they create an opportunity. They get to create the opportunity for quality interactions with their peers because then they invite those kids in, right? So the script has been flipped. So I have a lot more to say about Sandy, but you can imagine the shift in power and perception for these young people. I would argue that there are kind of four areas where schools have some tremendous leverage to make a difference around these issues. One is about relationships. I mentioned it earlier, right? How do we pay attention to the relationships so every student is known, right, in the ways that is culturally responsive, as Anna Christina was talking about. There's the curriculum, which is a piece of it, but there's also the professional development. How do we make sure that educators are equipped actually to build belonging, and it's not just the role of the EL teacher or the school counselor, and young people. How are we taking advantage of school and student leaderships like these young people who themselves become leaders in creating peer-to-peer belonging opportunities? And then the last thing I'll say is we are in a reactive moment, and I understand why we're in a reactive moment. But reactive change is a good place to start, but we have to move from systemic. So it's one thing to think about how we're offering trauma support, but it's just another to start to think about how you're building towards culture and rituals. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through every one of these pieces of the slide, but I've given you on the left-hand side, these are these levers, and what do we think about, what does it look like in a reactive mode, a proactive mode, or a systemic mode? So this is, hopefully something to begin to get us thinking about taking advantage of schools. Thank you so much. I hope to talk more with you all in a bit.
Adam, thank you so much. Give us so much food for thought there. Last but finally not least, John Yang, President of the Asian Americans Advancing Justice. John, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much. My name is John Yang. I'm the President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. So we're a civil rights organization. Our mission is to advance the civil and human rights of Asian Americans and to promote a fair and equitable society for all. So what does that mean? That means we focus on policy advocacy, we focus on education, we focus on empowering our community. Typically, the issue areas that we're involved in include immigration, anti-hate, racial profiling, census, voting rights, technology, as well as education. And so how we do this, how the perspective I come from is, I will admit, we're based in Washington, D.C., so I come from a quote-unquote Hill perspective, thinking about policy, how we move policy to help all of our communities. I really appreciate and thank the organizers for including us as part of this conversation, because I think we talk about the intersectionality between race and ethnicity and nativity, but also the intersectionality between the work that organizations like ours do and the work that organizations like all of yours do, and how we all intersected with each other and the conversation that we need to have together. When I think about this topic, it's interesting because we're almost creating, I don't know if I would call it a false juxtaposition, but a juxtaposition between nativity and race and ethnicity that is almost a fictional one. And what do I mean by that? You know, certainly in politics today, when people talk about the native born, they're not talking about Native Americans. They're at best maybe talking about people from the Mayflower or people that went to Jamestown. But when we talk about the native born, if we're being true to that, that includes many, many of us that might not look like the people on the Mayflower, that might not look like the people at Jamestown. I appreciate that Adam brought up birthright citizenship in San Francisco with the Supreme Court case. It was a case by the name of Wong Kim Ark. Wong Kim Ark was native born to the United States, yet he was treated as a foreigner because of his race and ethnicity. So I think we have to sit and pause with that a moment when we talk about these issues to make sure that when we talk about them, we're also challenging people to think about what native born means, right? Because I think that is so important in this dialogue right now. For the Asian American community, let me put some context to all of this. For our community, approximately 60%, maybe a little bit under that, are immigrants, i.e. born in a different country. About 90% of our community are either immigrants or children of immigrants. So on one hand, you could say that largely our population is foreign-born, but then obviously for the vast majority of those communities, we have already become citizens. So we are certainly American by that definition, right? And to make sure we understand the difference between the two of those. Why I point that out is because of this notion that, like, when we talk about the Asian American community, one of the myths that we always face is being considered a foreigner, what we always call the perpetual foreigner myth. And that's typified. And I can assure you, when we talk about in the education spaces for even my kids, I have two kids, that one in high school, one in middle school, the number of times that they get asked, well, where are you from? And when they say, well, I'm from Washington, D.C., in my case, I'm from Chicago, they ask, well, where are you really from? Right? And this notion that we really can't be from the United States. So really challenging that notion. Why does that matter? How that matters is manifests itself in policy in so many different ways. When you talk about COVID-19 as the most recent example, is what happened was because COVID-19 originated, by all scientific accounts, originated in China, the Chinese people as a whole and Asian population as a whole got, quote unquote, blamed for COVID-19. What we saw during 2020, 2021 was a huge spike in anti-Asian hate. I know many of you in this community have helped us during that time, have raised alarm about these issues. But it was because of this notion that because of something that happened in a foreign country, we as Americans, albeit that may have been born in that foreign country, were targeted with that. And this is just not an isolated incident. You know, if you look back historically, again, for those people from different races and ethnicities that might not be considered, quote unquote, native born, that's always been part of our history. Whether you go back to 9/11, when, yes, there was a terrorist attack on the United States, at the same time, many people that were blamed were just simply Muslim, Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern people that had nothing to do with the attacks. You go back to World War II, when Americans of Japanese descent, many born in the United States, were incarcerated here in the United States because of the Japanese emperor and World War II. I am in no way apologizing or saying that what the Japanese emperor did is right, but what happens in those foreign countries should not be the cause of pain in the United States. And then we go back even to the building of the railroads, where much of the most dangerous work that was done by Chinese workers that did the dynamiting through the Rocky Mountains in the West. But then after the railroads were built, they were literally washed out of the photos of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And then they were blamed for taking, quote unquote, American jobs. So when I think about this intersection between native born and race and ethnicity, I think about all of these policy issues that arise because of it. One thing that we're seeing now in the education space, in many spaces, is the tension between the United States and the Chinese government. Chinese government is brutal. It's a dictatorship. It does not believe in human rights. Let me make sure that I say that very clearly. At the same time, that should not be cause for our American government to be targeting people of Chinese descent or of Asian descent, suggesting that they somehow must be spies for the Chinese government, which is what we are seeing in academic institutions, where this notion that we have seen in prior administrations that have said that all Chinese students in the United States must be spies for the government. We should have a case open for Chinese espionage in every U.S. attorney's office in the United States. Those are the types of excesses that we have to protect against. I think the other thing that I would say at the outset is just making sure we understand our communities. With respect to the Asian community, we're talking about the 50 different races and ethnicities, over 100 different languages that are spoken. One of the myths, the second myth that I always talk about, is this notion of a model minority, that Asian Americans are model minorities, that somehow we do better, we don't need help. On one level, if you look at the aggregate, perhaps on the aggregate, Asian Americans, with respect to social economic indicators, do quite well, maybe sometimes even above average on some of these indices. But when you start to break that down, and this is what I so much appreciate about Professor Traub's presentation, she did not simply say Hispanic Americans felt this way or Asian Americans felt that way. She said Mexican Americans, Indian Americans. That's the level of specificity that we need to understand it. Because if you just say that Asian Americans are a model minority, there's three problems with that. First is it's simply not true. Yes, there are some, and I think she pointed out Indian Americans, Chinese Americans do pretty well on certain social economic settings. Even there, you have to break it down into Chinese Americans, which immigrant class, if you will, they fell from, right? Because the Chinese Americans in Chinatown are very, very different than some of the Chinese Americans coming over today. Second would be that not only is it inaccurate, it's limiting. Because by saying that not the Asian Americans are a model minority, it is somehow suggesting that our community doesn't need help or that there aren't issues with respect to our community. The last and probably the most pernicious of those is this notion that because Asian Americans are doing well, therefore other races, other ethnicities that are not as doing as well are at fault. It's not that America's not discriminatory anyway, because look, Asian Americans are doing well. Rather, something is wrong with these other groups that are causing them not to prosper. And that's what we have to challenge, this notion that somehow the United States structurally doesn't have problems. Now, again, to be clear, this country has been great at many, many things. But for us to also be honest with ourselves and say that we still have structural problems with respect to racism, with respect to discrimination, I don't think should be that controversial. And I think most Americans would recognize that. And so being very open about that. And then I think the last thing I would point to is in terms of language access, in terms of the issues that we're looking at right now. And again, it's interesting because on one level, I might even understand people that want to focus on English as the language that the United States should be focused on. But let's also be real. This is almost like suggesting that immigrants don't want to learn English. We all know that that is just simply not true. Rather, what we need are the resources to navigate in this American system. Healthcare opportunities, economic opportunities, everything is better when all people have access. Simply because English is not your first language should not be a barrier. Just like simply because you have a disability should not be a barrier to anything that you do in life. So in terms of the issues that I look at, one is this perpetual foreigner notion. Two is making sure we have the data on all of the communities that we are actually serving in the level of detail that is necessary. And three is that we are truly integrating people, whether it's because of language, whether it's because of disabilities, so that they can actualize the potential that they have. From here, I will yield the floor and happy to engage in a conversation.
All right. Well, thank you so much, John. And thanks to all the panelists. We invite you now to the roundtable discussion, and I hope you can turn on your cameras to discuss these incredibly interesting and thought-provoking arguments you all made, and inform our discourse here. So I'll start with the idea of the perpetual foreigner and the need for disaggregated data, and the need to address these issues of normativity, of normalizing white norms and accepting them as the dominant, and everybody else is a foreigner. There are African Americans who've been living in this country for centuries, and they still feel they're not citizens or full citizens. So if we think about this as a social problem, what is the origin of this problem? Is this a public perception problem, or how do you again move from white normativity to multiculturalism and seeing this country as a diverse, multilingual, multicultural country? What is if you think about this as the problem, what is the solution to it? From a policy perspective and not from individual level perspectives. we see a lot of individual programs or individual interventions popping up, but then, they disappear because there's no institutionalization. If we focus on the idea of moving us as a country to multiculturalism, multilingualism, to that view and that perception, what would it take to create that public consciousness? After so many years, and we see a huge backlash now of returning the country to, or attempts to return the country to really strict white norms and white supremacy notions. And anybody can address that.
I guess I could start. I mean, it's certainly from my perspective, education, a number of the panelists talked about this, education is critical. Just being honest about what our history has been, all the good things as well as all the bad things. And that will start to normalize that, like, our history has always been rich in culture, not just a white culture, but all sorts of different cultures that have contributed including when different cultures have been oppressed. The other thing that I do want to give some hope here, because I feel like in this moment, we're all feeling like we're just being pushed back on. The reality is, until around the 1960s, that was the norm. It wasn't until the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the Voting Rights Act in 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, that we had more of a public consciousness. So that's only 60 years. So on one hand, we need to push. As an advocate, I will always push. On the other hand, we also should give ourselves a little bit of grace and also push back against those that said, well, we're already there. No, 60 years of history compared to 250 years of history, there is no way that we're already there. So reminding ourselves of the recency of that changing of the norm, changing of understanding, I think is important in our dialogues.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Trump?
Thank you. Yeah, I feel so compelled to follow up a bit with what John was saying. I was in graduate school living in California during the proposition put forward English for our children, where it was like this English only movement, right? And at the time I was actually doing research on the effects of bilingual education in elementary schools. And really thinking about it from an intergroup contact lens, that on the one hand, having facility across linguistic difference provides opportunities for direct communication between groups, but it also serves as a cue toward equalizing the status positions of the groups in that context, right? Because and here I'm thinking about it not only from an access to resource perspective, so I absolutely agree 100% with what John was saying. And I would add also from a psychological perspective, because if you are in a classroom that's mostly of white, native-born US kids, and there's just a couple Latino kids, it's really easy for those white kids to think, oh, those Latino kids are stupid because they can't speak my language. But if they have their own experience of trying to learn the other language where they see those Latino kids are totally fluent, then their attribution shifts and they realize, oh, it's hard to learn another language. So the way that they interpret the exact same educational context is quite different. And we have research to show, I've been like opening so many windows as people have been talking, because I like to cite my sources. But we have some research to show that for white kids in bilingual, ethnically mixed classrooms, they show less bias in their attitudes, like they're pro-white relative to pro-Latino attitudes, as compared to white kids in English-only classrooms with only token minority representation of Latino kids. So that's something in terms of the structure that you were talking about that we can try to do. Another thing that I do want to emphasize, if I may, and I'd be curious to hear others' thoughts on it, and I'm just trying to find my next reference. So, and I really got into this type of work thinking about racial integration and equity, and now thinking about how it applies to different domains and sectors. And so some of the work that we've done has not only been focused on kids and the context in which they're embedded, but also thinking about the context in which teachers are embedded. So the more research I've done in schools, what I often see is teachers in training are about 80% white, increasingly teaching in mostly Black and brown classrooms where they have little interracial contact experience outside of those classrooms. And so when I've talked with teachers, doing research in the schools, as an informal ombudsperson, they will disclose to me, like, I'm on board with all this diversity stuff. I just wasn't trained to do this. So, like, don't put it all on my shoulders because I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. And so one of the things that we've started to look at are the teachers' interracial friendship networks. And we actually find that the more racially and ethnically diverse teachers' friendship networks are among white teachers in particular, the more confident they feel about engaging students from different backgrounds in their classrooms, which has huge implications for the quality of the education that these kids will get. Because having good teacher-student relationships has been shown to be associated with improved educational outcomes. And so one of the things that we're doing in the racial ethnic context of the US is developing teacher training materials to help teachers just feel more prepared to engage with difference by integrating principles about positive behavioral support strategies from school psychology, as well as principles from the study of relations between groups in social psychology to enhance those, ecosystems and infrastructures in which teachers and students are embedded.
Thank you.
And is it all right to add a little more context, which is
Of course.
so
Yes.
I mean from thinking about the historical sweep of the United States, right? I think it is fair to say after periods of big demographic change, backlash is predictable. You could talk about it from a psychological perspective. Linda is better at this than I am by a lot. But that said, that if you look at folks who don't have quality contact, but they're aware of the diversity, they freak out. They freak out. So how do we actually, in those moments, after you've had a demographic spike, say, wait, let's be very intentional about building bridges. This is true. You look at the early 20th century, the big spike in immigration. Guess what? That's when we start to have anti-immigrant policies change, starting with Chinese exclusion, right? Working its way up through the 24 Act. I would argue that we are experiencing the backlash to the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act because the visible demographic change that was associated with that act is now all sorts of places. So we're having this moment where we see the diversity, but we don't have the opportunity. We do have the opportunity. We're just not taking advantage of it, and it's gotten worse with COVID. It's gotten worse with technology making it easier to retreat from public spaces. It's why I think we have to be very strategic about the levers in the public spaces we have to change the narrative and build quality contacts. It's why I care so deeply about schools, but there are other places too.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just
Chris.
want to reiterate, all this conversation is so important, especially with regards to school, which has been the majority of my work, but especially as we prepare professionals to enter into teaching or different roles in schools, how important it is to create opportunities, a pathway for them to begin to understand in their preparation years how important it is to engage with populations that they might not have had much experience with before. And so we know that a lot of the DEI initiatives in college prep programs have been eliminated because of propositions that have been passed with regards to funding research and so forth. I have many colleagues who actually have lost their jobs as university teacher educators for creating opportunities for pre-service teachers to engage with populations that are of diverse backgrounds, and which is imperative, frankly. And so I think we have to really understand that teachers and administrators and and the public in general, I believe, would like to see a greater integration, a sense of legitimacy for families and students. But right now, we are under a lot of pressures, political pressures, and economic pressures to eliminate the very things that have been put into place to begin to mediate for this issue.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I'd like to really emphasize what Adam had said about retreating in ourselves. It's really the human condition that we are afraid of difference. So that is really verified in research that we've done in areas of the state where nascent diversity is still or diversity is still at its infancy. And we've seen, a lot of fear of people who have been there of that difference that is coming in their neighborhoods. So that gives birth to the idea of managing diversity that Dr. Trapp talked about and Dr. De Silva. In really what you referred to, Dr. Trapp, as the structured opportunities to nurture context. We also seen it in organizational research that we've done where, when you have diversity where there are really power asymmetries, you tend to see a lot of conflicts. And diversity creates conflicts. Putnam's theory about retreating in our as turtle, we become turtles and retreat in our shells when we face diversity. That's a human condition. So unless we really structure it and manage diversity intentionally, deliberately, it's going to create conflicts rather than integration. And exposure, obviously, and having quality contacts, as some of you have referred to, it's really important. So let's talk about the practices or the structured opportunities many of you have alluded to. Let's delve deeper into those. How do you institutionalize them? We want to move away from the individual efforts of one teacher or one intervention that is funded, but then when the grant expires, the program goes away. How do we institutionalize it in policies, in the fabric of systems so that it does not disappear? And what do we learn from the civil rights movement, from that you all alluded to, that we can do now, or from the disabilities movement, like the curve cut effect? What do we learn that we can do at this moment to further institutionalize? Linda, Dr. Trapp.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I can only speak to a piece of all the great questions that you just posed. But I did want to speak to some of those conditions or features of social structures and community spaces that we can try to intentionally design to promote the likelihood of positive outcomes, social cohesion, improved relations, more peaceful relations, and so on. And here I had to write down this quote from Adam where he said, belonging doesn't just happen, it's the result of practices and policies. Because I think oftentimes the type of research I do on intergroup contact is misinterpreted, where people, ask me questions like, well, we tried putting people together and we didn't see any positive outcomes. And I'm like, because you have to be intentional. You have to think about where people are coming from, what their concerns are. And really kind of have respect and compassion for that human condition that you were just talking about, right? I don't want us to blame people if they're not engaging across lines of difference because it's less comfortable than hanging out with people that we know. And it's a very natural, adaptive psychological response to want to feel comfortable. And I think what we need to do is create the structures and also let people know, yeah, you might feel a little uncomfortable in the short term, but in the long term, you'll feel part of this bigger community where you don't have to feel fear. And no one wants to be in a fearful state for that long. It's not good for our health. It's not good for society. And so we've spent the last several years working with lots of civil society organizations and groups of practitioners implementing bridging programs, because there's a growing bridging movement that's been happening in the United States in light of all the social division that we're facing across economic lines, ethno-racial lines, partisan lines. And what we've basically learned from participating in these communities of practice and having all these discussions are a lot of those challenges and barriers that people get to when they're trying to design and implement these programs. So what we decided to do was to develop some guidance about that. And so I'm going to share the link to that guide, the Cultivating Contact Guide that I referenced at the end of my comments, because at a theoretical perspective, the types of conditions you want to infuse in these situations where groups come together include things like establishing equal status to the fullest extent possible between those groups, trying to let people know, like, okay, there might be status differences in the broader society, but here, everyone's treated as equals, everyone has the same opportunity, communicating those norms. And that relates to one of the other conditions referred to as institutional support or authority support, as if the community leaders, facilitators, teachers, principals, school administrators are all saying, yes, you should interact with each other. It's a good thing to interact across difference, and you should do so as equals. And then also creating cooperative, interdependent activities or learning strategies where people from different groups really have to rely on each other and work together cooperatively to achieve shared goals. It could be toward a community problem. It could be learning a lesson plan. It can be many different contexts. We've got some research where we had Black, Latino, and white community residents in segregated parts of Chattanooga, Tennessee come together to build park spaces, right? To have like co-ownership of those park spaces that they all feel like they contributed and they can all feel a sense of belonging. Those are the types of things, taking these principles and then thinking about what can I do in my context that kind of embodies those principles. And so that's what we've attempted to do in this guide, is just give people examples so that they can see more concretely what might equal status look like in a program? What might cooperation look like in a program? Why is it important to establish kind of ground rules for how we're going to be here? Because if we don't, people will assume it'll just be business as usual, like what we experience in the broader society. Why is it so important to give people instructions for what they're going to do together and be so intentional about it? Because left to their own devices, it'll be like at a cocktail party where you don't know who to talk to and it feels awkward, so you don't do it, right? So we've tried to take the basic theoretical principles and give concrete insights about what could be done. But there's no magic bullet. There's no one right answer. It really depends on the local context, what might be effective.
Right.
Can I follow up on the local
Please.
context? So Reimagining Migration is a national organization. One of the things that, and so we used to do our work where, our staff would do facilitation of things locally. One day, my colleague and I, after doing a workshop with teachers in Lincoln, Nebraska, we're like, no, it was good, but no, somebody from Lincoln needs to be doing that work, right? And so, because they understand what that sounds like in their community, what that looks like in their communities. What are the buzzwords that are dangerous, right? They will understand the predictable third rails as well as have some sense of the opportunity. So I want to suggest some high level principles that might be worth thinking about if we're talking about building a national movement. These are all totally stolen from Welcoming America and conversations with their team, which is a great organization. One thing I think it's really important, let's start by mapping what's going on in our local communities and really getting a sense of where there are spaces of belonging, where there's best practices, but also what are the barriers. Number two, once you've mapped this, start to really, think about where is it that we want to go and what are those opportunities to get there? And again, who are those folks doing that work? Right? Because in every community, there's a vision of what this looks like. My sister-in-law teaches EL for adult learners. That is a vision of what we want every class in the United States to look like. But those teachers are marginalized. But if we could lift up those kind of best practices, because those places are classrooms of community, right? So how do we start to lift up those best practices? Then have folks pilot and measure. And then I would argue, once you've got enough of a body of evidence, I think you can start to advocate for a local standard these are the conditions locally in terms of policy that we want to move towards. And then let those communities own it. This is Lincoln, Nebraska's vision of what we think belonging is going to look like. Because Adam Strom and Boston's vision is annoying and sounds like I'm know too many people at Harvard, right? So I just, I would argue that we start local and really, really, really go deeply. It doesn't mean that folks like Linda and myself and John, Dr. De Silva, doesn't have big places to inspire, but that work has to not be done by us.
Right. And yeah, I totally agree, Adam. Everything is really local and contextual, and one size does not fit all, for sure, which complicates the picture really more. But you can you can take an evidence-based program and adapt it to the local program by doing what Adam had just described, piloting it and tweaking it. All right. Anybody else want to weigh in?
Again, just wanted to, I'm excited about this conversation because especially the idea of developing principles principles of practice, especially, with respect to schools and teachers and families and communities. There are things that we can do to create these intentional spaces, as you were describing earlier, where there is not just a very surface level contact, but also there are opportunities for relationships, long lasting, durable relationships to flourish. And I think that, to investigate how that can be co-constructed by different members of the community, including, in my case, university faculty and our teachers in preparation, with community members, with families, with teachers, and to create these opportunities for exchange. Again, I have done several of these models and they all look very different because we do have to, first of all, really listen to what the community desires, what their aspirations are, and how they view themselves as legitimate members of these school communities. And I will copy Linda, and I will send out in the chat some of the work that I have done in this respect. But this is really important and exciting conversation that I hope that we can continue at some point, extracting some of these principles that have worked for each one of us in this screen, to start creating from these principles ways of practice.
Thank you, Dr. De Silva. And I'd like to call on John and ask him, from where you're sitting in your vantage point, what are, as we face the challenges of federalism at the state level, are there any state policies that could help address some of the issues that we have talked about today?
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, I think people address that part of it is research, because I think once we have data, that is helpful. Really empowering local communities is absolutely important. The other piece that I think we haven't talked about that I would emphasize is how we think about the media, how we think about information. Because one of the problems that I see right now is we are all in our own information silos, and we're all guilty of it to a certain extent. So how do we reach out, right? I do make it a point, and so obviously, given the organization that I'm at, I don't think I'm shocking anyone to say that I would be considered a progressive or a liberal. That said, I will make sure that I try to read Wall Street Journal, Fox News, when I can, because part of this, and this goes to what all the speakers are saying, is like having empathy, is understanding why even people who disagree with us have the views that they do. By and large, maybe there's some prominent examples, but by and large, people are good people. But they just have views for different reasons. It's a fear, it's a threat that all of you have talked about, all of us have talked about. So how do we understand that more so that when we reach out in our local communities, we can have that conversation in a different way. I know that that's on one hand still a community level response instead of a policy level response, but I do think that that's important. On a policy level, though, I do think that there is something to be said about thinking about misinformation, disinformation, thinking about AI, like how that is affecting the media that we get, how that is affecting the results that we get whenever we run any sort of search, whether it is on Google or on Chat GPT. It's a name your device. I think those pieces, although that gets into the weeds a little bit, are also important to make sure that we have an open society that really listens to each other.
And absolutely, public policy can provide resources for sustaining some of these programs and sustaining civil society efforts. So that is important. I'd like to open it up for the participants. And I've seen some raised hands, but I believe that we are in a webinar format, unable to have the participants dialogue directly with the panelists. My assumption is that it's only through the chat. Guillermo, correct me if I'm wrong, or Birgit. But I think that the participants can put down their questions in the chat. Yes, only through the chat, because webinar format is not going to allow it. Odalis, you raised your hand, and I've seen Mohammed have raised his hand as well. Can you please put down your questions in the chat, and we will be happy to address them. And so while you are doing that, I'd like to bring it back to the classroom and Dr. De Silva's work in the classroom and in the schools. And I know from, again, research that we've done in the post-secondary context that the teacher, and of course what Dr. Trupp had alluded to, the teacher structuring programs where there is contact between teachers and increasing that intergroup contact is very important. But we've seen, the paradigm of socio-collaborative learning being emphasized, where you create pedagogical practices and of course, structure the classroom interactions in ways where there is peer teaching, there is accountability for each other and others learning, where there is scaffolding and support and peer relations, student to student, student to teacher. Anyone wants to delve a little bit deeper on the role of the teacher in structuring pedagogical practices, instructional practices that promote this climate of welcoming climate of belonging, really, and really addressing that competitiveness, because competitiveness can really kill any kind of socio-collaborative learning. So as the hierarchical teaching.
I think it's a responsibility, and as educators, I think we don't have the luxury to not address these important issues. So, as a teacher educator, I try to really create convictions and solid theoretical research-based knowledge for the teachers who are in preparation to understand the importance. But beyond that, they need to also have this important contact with not just the students, but also extend it to families, extend into the communities, to be able to get to know and to really listen and become observant of what are the practices of these communities, and to see it as asset for them, that knowledges that need to be leveraged into the curriculum, so that children will be reflected in their knowledge, their lived experiences can be reflected in the day-to-day curriculum delivery. And so it's integral to the practice of a teacher. And I think that is really a moral imperative.
Thank you, Dr. De Silva. Anybody else want to comment? I don't see any questions. Guillermo, if you see them, let me know.
If I
Yeah, I mean,
may,
Oh,
there are two in the Q&A.
yeah,
Yes,
they're in the
absolutely.
they're in the Q&A, exactly.
And I'll do my
Thank
best to
you.
briefly respond, if I may, to the one that Kim presented about how
Yes.
welcome different groups felt. Um, she mentions the language barrier, and I would say absolutely. So part of the reason and rationale for choosing first generation Mexican and Indian immigrants was because of kind of the different, not just the different contexts of reception in terms of location where they land, but in terms of their own characteristics that they bring to that might contribute to shaping how they're either received or what their experience is like. And so between having both higher levels of education, tending to come to the US for white collar jobs and English language proficiency or fluency, we would expect Indian immigrants to have very different initial experiences. And you actually see when we look at our data, Indian immigrants not only feel more welcome in relation to the US born, they also tend to live in more white communities. And in the qualitative data we have, they talk about, oh, my neighbors hosted a potluck. It's just like this very different entry process, whereas Mexican immigrants often felt without as much fluency on average in English that, and entering disproportionately in lower wage labor markets, that they just didn't have those opportunities for engagement in a peer-to-peer way. It was more offering services or, working in landscaping in neighborhoods where other people live, not living in those same neighborhoods, helping to prepare produce for the marketplaces as compared to shopping in the same places. So you could see those equalizing versus non-equalizing factors just in the nature of the interactions that they would have.
Thank you, Dr. Trop. So Jill Adam, did you want to add
I
in?
was gonna go into the next question about backlash.
Oh, please go ahead.
But yeah, if it's useful, barriers. One of the things in the education space, I think there's been a tremendous amount of pressure on educational administrators. Some of that has been organized from community groups. Some of that has been about the administration policy level. There was a win in courts last week that some of the anti-DEI work is actually that has been thrown out. But that said, there's another factor here that when did a survey around anti-immigrant attitudes at schools, unfortunately, about a quarter of the folks that we surveyed, this is a very small survey, said that the anti-immigrant attitudes were coming from educators within a building. So that's not, we can't assume homogeny in terms of ideas. That said, even with that said, that we find the educators who are looking for our work come from all over the place. You can make no geographical assumptions. I think even in the most politically conservative spaces, there are people who want to do the best for their young people. And so what I think, I mean, this is about the local translation. How do you empower those folks in those buildings? Because they're going to be able to navigate the backlash in ways that, again, all of us aren't going to as well. Because I really see hope. I mean, I'm shocked at where people are downloading material from our website from.
Nice. It's with that, I know that we are out of time, unfortunately. And thank you for giving that hope message at the end. And I would like to thank our distinguished speakers for inviting us to see immigrant inclusion not as a sectoral issue confined in one sector, but really as a defining test for democratic governance itself. So Dr. De Silva, Your work on multilingual learners and immigrant families and had this made us see them not as problems to be solved, but assets to be recognized. You challenged us to look at the educational system and move beyond, the assimilationist models toward pedagogies rooted in cultural wealth and community knowledge and structural responsiveness. Thank you. Dr. Trop, your work on intergroup relations really provided us the empirical foundation for understanding how prejudice is reduced and how contact can really allow us to see each other, see the humanity in each other, and foster cooperation and help address some of the power asymmetries that shape our group dynamics. And Dr. John Yang, your work is so much appreciated. You translate these ideas into legal and structural protections for which we're really thankful. Your work ensures that inclusion is not just aspirational, but enforceable. And Adam, you really pushed us to rethink how migration itself is narrated and taught, how by transforming how educators frame migration as a fundamental and enduring feature of human history, you help cultivate classrooms that foster empathy, historical literacy, and a deeper sense of shared belonging. Inclusion is really cannot be achieved at a single level. It requires us to be intentional, deliberate, and transform or enact transformation across narratives, across classrooms, in research frameworks, in legal systems, and organizational structures. So with that, we thank you all for joining us and thank our panelists again, and hope you can stay engaged with us and look forward to seeing you in the next webinar. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.